Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. Today with us we have Paul Palango, an investigative journalist who's recently written a book, the second on the subject, on the 2020 massacres in Nova Scotia. He alleges a massive cover-up by the RCMP and the government. Check it out. Decide for yourself. It's a fascinating conversation. Today on the Line. This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Airbnb. Everyone agrees that Canada needs to take real action to tackle the housing crisis, but only a few people argue that short-term rentals like Airbnb are part of that solution. Countless experts have argued that short-term rental regulation is nothing more than a distraction, with the Harvard Business Review recently saying that, put simply, restricting Airbnb is not going to be an effective tool for solving the housing affordability problems. This makes sense when you consider two key statistics. Canada needs 5.8 million homes to reach affordability by 2030, and Airbnbs account for only 0.06% of Canada's overall housing stock. The closer you look, the clearer it gets that Canada needs bold action that addresses the entire housing market, not just 0.06% of it. Learn more at Airbnb.ca/closerlook. Well, today we have with us Paul Palango. Paul, where are you located right now?
I'm in Chester Basin, Nova Scotia, between sort of Peggy's Cove and Lunenburg, west of Halifax.
Fantastic. Well, Paul, I kind of introduced you already, but I just wanted to update. You've been a journalist in Canada since the 90s, I believe. You have a long pedigree.
No. I'm much older than that.
Much older than that?
Yeah,
Oh
I
my gosh.
started out in 1974 at the Hamilton Spectator.
74. Okay. All right.
I even had a brief time in sports covering the Toronto Blue Jays in their first season.
Okay, all right.
I went to the Globe and Mail. I went through the Globe and Mail as a reporter, editor, senior editor, and in charge of investigative reporting at the end of my term in 1990. Okay. And then I went into writing books, and I've written 5 books about the RCMP.
Okay, so that is my sin. The sin of my youth is coming to the fore here because, of course, nothing existed before 1991 for me. So thank you very much for joining me. You've become quite dogged in your reporting in the books that you've written on the 2020 Nova Scotia massacre. It's an interesting thing because that was, I think, the biggest massacre in Canadian history. And it's been almost memory hold. I think very few, even of our sort of informed listeners, will necessarily have a clear memory of what in the world happened in 2020. But 22 people died. It was a very significant shooting. And so I was just wondering, can you just give us a brief refresher on what happened there?
Sure. Well, Jen, first of all, it's not the largest. It's the largest gun-related one in modern history. I mean, we do have Air India and other bombings of airplanes. There's been 2 or 3 bombings of airplanes that were bigger than this over the years. But what happened in April 18th, 19th, 2020? Like most Canadians, I woke up on Sunday morning, April 19th, to the news, this vague news of a man dressed up as a policeman in a police car going around killing people. So what we learned is that Gabriel Wortman, a denturist in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, killed 13 of his neighbors in Portapique, Nova Scotia, which is just north of Truro. And then the next morning resumed his rampage into what I call a second massacre, and drove around Nova Scotia and killed 9 more people, including an RCMP constable, Heidi Stevenson, before he was shot and killed at the Irving Big Stop, the service center just north of the Halifax International Airport.
So there's a couple things about this story that really stand out from a distance, from someone who's not been in the weeds with it with you. And firstly, how in the world does a rampage span over 2 days? That seems insane to me. Like, it's, you see shootings in the United States, these things can last hours. But it seems really rare that something like this would last days. So do we have any clarity 5 years hence as to why police were unable to contain this individual within a reasonable time frame.
Well, what struck me right at the beginning in, April 19th, 2020, based on my experiences in dealing with the RCMP over the previous 30 years, is that it was an epic failure in policing. Like, it's never been that bad, and I've never seen a police force do worse. And I had people from inside the force and former senior members saying this is the worst day in the history of the RCMP. But no police force could be that dumb, it struck me, that there's something else going on. Like, why did they never get in front of workmen? They never put up a roadblock. They never saved one life. The RCMP never saved one life. It was totally inexplicable. And that's what sort of drew me into the story. I thought, well, the mainstream reporters will cover this, and maybe I'll help them with some of the insights I have. But when I tried to do that, I was basically told, go away, old man, you don't know what you're talking about. And I felt I did know what I was talking about, and they didn't know what they were doing. And so I undertook the project because I thought it was an important public policy issue. A police force had failed so miserably, 22 people had died. What was really going on? And the thing I decided to do was really unusual was write a book about it all before the mass casualty public inquiry was held, to put on record the things I could find and see that weren't being reported, and force the Mass Casualty Commission to address those things.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Mass Casualty Commission, which I believe happened a few years after the actual incident. But first, let's go into, again, with the benefit of a couple of years of hindsight, how did the RCMP screw this up? What did they do wrong from your perspective?
Well, it struck me from the beginning, and then I got sources on this saying that I should be looking into the fact that Gabriel Wortman may have had a special relationship with the RCMP as an informant or a police agent, and that something had gone wrong. And this is important to understand, because if he were an agent or an informant, the police are duty bound to never reveal that in life or death. He can die, and you still can't say he was an agent. And it's that sort of informed me from the beginning, and I began to find evidence suggesting that was true, even though the RCMP denied it with phrases like, we could find no evidence that he had a special relationship with. It was mealy-mouthed sort of denials, and I started to find evidence like payouts from him getting $475,000 from a Brinks Brinks security location, 18 days before the massacres, and other little relationships he had with police that seemed to defy the RCMP denials that he did not have a special relationship. And that's why in my first book, Before the Mass Casualty, the subtitle is, part of the subtitle is The Cover-Up and Obstacles to Justice in Nova Scotia. Like, how could I know that before the inquiry? Because unless I could see clear evidence of it. And people said to me when I wrote that book, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, et cetera, et cetera. I said, no, I'm basing this on facts. And then the second book became showing what really happened.
So do we have any insight into what he was likely informing the police about?
I think it's clear that he had ties. No, he was smuggling motorcycle parts across the border, guns, grenades, things like that never come up in any of the public discussions. And he was obviously dealing with motorcycle gangs, likely the Hells Angels, and there are all kinds of suggestions about that sort of relationships that don't make sense otherwise.
Right. So Gabriel Wortman was probably interconnected with criminal smuggling of some kind.
Oh, well, he was an admitted smuggler from the time he was in his late teens. Right. When he was in university at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, he was smuggling things across the border from Maine, including cigarettes, drugs, along with various other people. That's all on the public record. So he had a long track record of smuggling. that went
Right.
right up to almost his last days.
So you found evidence that he'd collected this very significant payout, probably from the RCMP or some intermediary by through the in, it, some intermediary paid him out, probably from the RCMP for the information that he was providing, probably about criminal networks. Um, do we have any better insight as to what his motive was for the actual shooting?
Well, at the end of Anatomy of a Cover Up, one of the interviews that was essentially suppressed by the Mass Casualty Commission is with a Halifax police officer, Constable Barry Warnell, who'd been the longest serving police officer in Halifax. And he was a longtime friend of Wortman's. He bought Wortman's original house on Pine Street or Pine Avenue in Dartmouth. They had worked on each other's properties. They knew each other right to the end. And in that interview, Warnell confirms what I long believed, that Wortman felt like he was a dead man walking in Nova Scotia, that there was obviously a threat on his life, and that he, according to Warnell, Wortman was intending to fake his own death and come back and collect all his money. And things went wrong. And then the killing spree sort of started as after things went wrong. Warnell's interview was completely buried. He was never called before the Mass Casualty Commission to talk about this, because this is something the RCMP had denied and the Mass Casualty Commission went along with, that there was any chance that Wortman was an informant. And that's clearly what Warnell was suggesting in the interview.
So, is it possible that Wortman was trying to stage some kind of fake death by cop?
Oh, fake death, not by cop.
Okay, so but like
Warnell,
it's one thing to say like, look, I'm gonna fake my death. It's another thing to fail in faking your death and go on a murder spree of killing 22 people.
well,
how do we
had
get from A to B there?
Wortman had a long history of arsons for money. He
Okay,
burned down a number of properties in the early 2000s in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, to collect the insurance money. And Warnell talks about that in his interview about the so-called legal fires that he committed. Um, at the time of the massacres, you have to remember that Nova Scotia was on lockdown because of COVID. The rest of Canada was.
sure.
If the suggestion from Warnell and others is that Wortman felt his life was immediately being threatened and there was no way out, he couldn't leave the province. The borders were shut down. The walls were closing in on him. He stashed all his money outside his property, which escaped the fires that burned down his two main properties in Portapic. I think he started killing people as sort of plan B, and things got out of hand because one of the first people he shot was Jamie Blair, and she didn't die right away. She got on 911, and he came back and killed her while she was on the phone with 911. So he knew his secret was gone, and so he had to do something else. So I think he tried to make it look like the cartels or the Hells Angels had come back and sought revenge on the neighborhood and killed him and a bunch of other people for some reason.
Oh, so this was about staging some
Yeah,
kind of faux gang shooting.
that's right. That's what it looks like. And then
Okay,
during the night, he disappeared, and the RCMP made it look like, oh, we don't know where he went. I've had suggestions since the new book has come out in the last couple of weeks from people coming forward saying that Wortman was actually negotiating with the police that night and he couldn't get what he wanted. And the next 9 killings, which I call the second massacres, where he roamed all over Nova Scotia, were him getting revenge on the RCMP for ruining his life.
oh, okay. So the first day of killing, were those targeted shootings, in the sense, was he targeting potentially people who were complicit in crime as well, or was he just targeting neighbors, like, or were they just random shootings that he was likely creating in order to create this facade? Do we know?
Well, there's a couple of things. There's, first of all, the first people he seemed to have shot were Greg and Jamie Blair. And Jamie Blair had, in her previous life, in her maiden name, Jamie Grado, um, most people didn't realize, but she was a key witness involving the murder of former Hells Angel Randy Mercero back in 1999.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were Hells Angels connections to her.
Okay.
And that could have been, in Wortman's mind, that could have been a revenge thing. And the RCMP even mentioned this in their 911 calls arriving at the scene that night. Be alerted that Jamie Blair is actually Jamie Grado, a witness in the Mercero killing.
Right.
So they were aware of that. And then the other person who was killed who had outlaw biker connections was Aaron Tuck, and then his wife, Jolene Oliver, and their daughter, Emily. Those, to me, seem to fit that sort of pattern. All the other people killed in Portapique, I suspect, were people who saw him.
Oh, so he was just taking out witnesses then at that point.
He was taking out witnesses because the Galenchans who lived next to the Blairs, somewhere up the road, may have been standing at their window after the gunshots went off. He may have seen them, gone in, killed them, burned their house down.
Right.
Same thing with the Harry and Peter and Joy Bond. They lived next to the Tuck family. He came out of the driveway. I was told that they were standing in the picture window looking right out at him. They went to their house, killed them. We don't know why the Zalls were killed on Portapique Beach Drive. That's a mystery. But of all the killings, one stands out. And that's the death of Corey Ellison, who was an innocent bystander. And if people remember back then, after the massacres, there was this touching interview with filmed by Brett Ruskin of the CBC of Clinton Ellison coming out of who'd been rescued after being in the woods for 4 hours, saying he was chased down the road by the killer with a flashlight. He hid in the woods, and his brother Corey had been killed. And over time, Clinton Ellison came to realize it wasn't Wortman chasing him down the road, but it was actually Mounties who were on the scene who had flashlights. And secondly, Clinton Ellison has always said repeatedly, "I think the Mounties shot my brother Corey."
And so it's possible that Corey Ellison was actually shot by friendly fire, not shot by
absolutely
Gabriel Wortman.
So if you assume that, that in putting together Anatomy of a Cover-Up, I looked at the RCMP narrative for what happened that night at that location. And I show how the RCMP, the Federal Department of Justice, and the Mass Casualty Commission, supposedly doing an independent investigation, all coalesced around the same story. Wortman escaped through an unknown road in a blueberry patch and got away. And what I show in the book is that didn't happen.
Okay, so let's because this timeline stuff is really important. So yeah. You mentioned earlier when we were talking that the RCMP was almost certainly in contact with Wortman after the first 13 deaths. So how do we know that?
Well, we don't know it specifically, but what we do know, and I show in Anatomy of a Cover-Up, that Wortman, there are 6 occasions on the 19th, the 18th and the 19th, where the RCMP get calls near where Wortman is that put them off the track. So, for example, when he's in Glenholm on the Sunday morning around 10 o'clock, the RCMP think they have him pinned down. I show how he gets away. But while he's getting away, a call comes in that there's a dead woman in a car in the Hidden Hilltop campground, just north of where they thought they had him pinned down. The RCMP raced there. There is no woman in a car. But by then, Wortman is already in Debert, and he kills 2 VON nurses there on the road.
So let's go back to the original. The first shootings happened, 13 deaths happened. According to the Mass Casualty Commission and sort of the official story, Wortman manages to escape through an unknown road through a blueberry patch. You're saying that's not what happened. That's not how he escaped. How did he escape then?
He drove right past them.
He drove right past them. Now, was he in uniform at this point, or was
He's in his
he?
fake uniform and his replica police car. He drove right past them. That's the only way he could have gotten out. And it conforms with one of the things that always bothered me early on was that the RCMP couldn't come up with a firm timeline, and the timeline kept moving around. And in their original timeline, they said he left at 10:35 p.m. from Portapic, and that's when he got out.
Mm-hmm.
Then they later changed it to 10:45 p.m. and then he went out through the blueberry field. But the problem became Corey Ellison's murder, because Corey Ellison's camera on his phone, when they examined it, showed his last picture taken of Wortman's burning warehouse was at 10:40:12.
Right. So he
So
was still
Corey Ellison
alive
was
at
alive at 10:40:12.
10:40. And if Wortman was gone by 10:30, that means he couldn't have killed
He
Corey
couldn't have killed
Ellison.
him, so they changed it to 10:45. And then what I prove is all the evidence showing that he couldn't have gone that way because there were humongous obstacles and timing issues that he couldn't do it. But the most important piece of evidence that the RCMP, the Mass Casualty Commission, the DOJ buried was that a person named Dean Dillman, who worked for the Department of Natural Resources, was sitting at the top of the blueberry field at 10:38 till 10:52.
Right. So he would have
He
seen
never
if.
saw anything up there.
Right.
But he didn't appear out as a witness to the RCMP until after they had publicly described the getaway.
Right. So at this
But
point, Wortman.
he responded to their claiming that he left by 10:45 to go and say, "Well, I was there around that time and I didn't see him."
Right. Okay. So Wortman gets away. He probably gets away, as you're saying, not through the way the police said he got away, but rather because he just was wearing uniform and they just didn't notice him. Drives away. That night, do we know where he stays that night, or where he's hiding that night?
Well, they think, the evidence seems to suggest that he was hiding behind a welding shop near the Diefenbunker at De Burt Airport. And because there were all kinds of items found there days later that came from his car, he may well have been there, but why there? Like, was he expecting a plane? No, the airport there is still operational. Was he expecting to get flown out of there? What was going on? And if he was negotiating, there's a couple of pieces of evidence that he had a phone. And the RCMP denied this. And I show all the different ways this denial happened. Even in interviews, when witnesses brought up the phone, they were dissuaded from talking about the phone.
So witnesses saw him.
The police were not interested in his phone.
So there is evidence that Wortman had some kind of phone, and witnesses saw him with some kind of phone.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, so he's behind the Diefenbaker, maybe hoping to get some kind of flight out. How do we know for certain that he was negotiating with the RCMP during this period between Massacre 1 and Massacre 2?
We don't know for certain, because it's all inferred from the evidence. Right. And from confidential sources that I have in policing, saying this is what went on. And we know from the Mass Casualty Commission that the RCMP destroyed evidence. In fact, I have a document that I show in both books where they were destroying evidence 3 months after the murders, saying that, this was unnecessary. We didn't need this evidence. But I show that in the Mass Casualty Commission, there are extreme gaps in the evidentiary trail that are never explained. And everything about Wortman being a confidential informant, his criminal sources, his criminal background, his criminal friends, is all ignored in the Mass Casualty Report. Nothing, we never get into that. And it's the entire narrative is he's just a crazy rich denturist who had a fight with his girlfriend. He was a misogynist, and he went crazy and killed a bunch of people. That's the story. Doesn't make sense, because, Jen, I prove in Anatomy of a Cover-Up that the narrative and the structural points in that narrative across the entire narrative are almost all false based on their evidence, not only their evidence. It's false. So if that is all false, then you get into the negative proof of things. If their story is not true, what is the truth? And that's what I'm trying to dig out now more and more, show what the truth is of the story.
It seems like every book that you write just reveals more sources and data and evidence that's leading you down to a very different conclusion.
Well,
you're right.
In fact, what it's doing is it's narrowing the story. I'm getting rid of all the crap that's been thrown up there, and I'm eliminating all kinds of things. I mean, one of the problems I had early on is that I was over here and the mass media was over there, every other reporter, and I was here saying this story isn't right. My instincts and my information tell me this story isn't right. But to prove it, I've had to knock down a number of false stories and prove a number of things that are not true that the RCMP said. And as I prove those, it's done nothing to move the mass media in my direction. They're still there touting this story. He went through the blueberry field. He killed 22 people. They are ignoring. They staged a bunch of things, and they're ignoring this because to ignore the story is better for them, because if they do admit I'm right, then they have to sort of show the world what they did wrong and how they misreported the story.
Well, I want to get into the mass media stuff because we're gonna talk about a little bit about that kind of stuff. But first, I just want to make sure that I have your understanding of the story correct. So, from what we know, Gabriel Wortman is spending the night out by the Diefenbunker, sometime between the first massacre and the second massacre. You believe that he's attempting to some kind of negotiation with the RCMP to basically get out of Dodge, essentially, with some of his money intact. Presumably those negotiations don't go well, and that's when the massacre shifts from being a shooting of neighbors and witnesses to a massacre of police officers.
Well, one police officer is killed.
Or that's what his attempt is anyway.
Yeah, that his rage, and I have this since Anatomy of a Cover-Up came out a month ago. I've had other people step forward now, filling in the gaps.
Okay.
And I'm confident that in due course we're going to break through this wall and find out the real story. But the indications I'm getting from the new sourcing is that he was negotiating that night, and it didn't go his way, and that was the final sort of rampage he had because he wasn't going to go to jail. He said that to his girlfriend, Lisa Banfield, on the Saturday, the day before, or the day the massacre started, that they drove by Spring Hill Penitentiary, and he said, I'm never going in there.
So he just said, screw it. At that point, he probably is aiming for death by cop. He's just going to go out in a blaze of glory at that point.
I would think there is something like that going on, that because one of the telling things was that after he killed Constable Heidi Stevenson, his 20th victim, he set the car on fire and he had $20,000 at least in cash in the car. He just burned it all.
So he was done at that point.
Yeah, he was done. He knew it was over.
Right. So one thing you'd mentioned when we started this chat was you were noting that the RCMP didn't shut down any roads, even though they had this very dangerous killer, presumably dressed as an RCMP officer, on the run throughout at least like 4 separate locations in Nova Scotia. Why didn't they shut down the roads?
Well, they never put out a public alert. They didn't tell people of Nova. They were using Twitter. They didn't shut down the roads, they said, because they didn't want to create a confrontation that might end up messy.
But it was messy at this point. Like the mess was, like at this point you almost want to have a confrontation so that no more innocent people get killed.
But what was really going on again is that the RCMP, and I wrote this in 22 Murders in 2022, the RCMP clearly didn't want to alert the world to what was going on. They were trying to contain this internally. They never called for help from any other police forces, but they did call on the RCMP in New Brunswick to come and help.
Right.
They tried to keep this all in-house and in Colchester County, hoping they could resolve it by the morning and not let it out of Colchester County. So even to their own officers, they didn't tell anyone outside of Colchester County what was going on. Heidi Stevenson was at Enfield in Hants County, to the south of Colchester County, the morning of the 19th. She didn't know what was going on. There was reports of a man who had killed a few people up there in Colchester County, 35 miles to the north, 50 kilometers, but no sense it was coming her way. One of the people working out of the Enfield detachment that day had to call a friend in another detachment in Sackville, New Brunswick, to find out what was going on, because the Mounties were not telling their own officers, which indicates they were trying to keep it and resolve the situation in Colchester County. After they found out that Wortman, for example, had gone through the town of Truro, only then, after they knew he'd gone through Truro, did they phone the Truro police and say, or contact the Truro police chief, Dave McNeil, and say, oh, by the way, this guy's on the loose and may be in Truro. But they already knew he was through Truro, because they didn't want other police forces getting involved and being able to build files and examine what was going on. All of this suggests what they're hiding is Wortman's hidden relationship with the police, likely as an agent. Because they didn't want that revealed, and they didn't want other police forces investigating.
So if I'm going to play devil's advocate, I would note that the RCMP, and in fact, I think a lot of police agencies in Canada, have become dreadful at basic communication. Like, they don't talk to us, they don't talk to each other. There's a habit toward privacy and secrecy that is absurd, frankly, and we can talk about a little bit more of that, a bit more about that in a minute. But is it possible that these guys just didn't communicate appropriately because these agencies suck at communication?
Well, the RCMP is the leader in not communicating very well.
Yes, they're at the vanguard of the national.
And they don't communicate with other police officers, other police departments. I had a senior policeman tell me the other day, trying to deal with the RCMP goes this way. I'm a senior guy. I tell the RCMP what's going on. You know what they treat me as? A reliable source. Not as a police officer, a fellow police officer. I'm a reliable source. He said it's all one way to them. They will not discuss with other forces what's going on. And I think other police forces, if you look at Southern Ontario, the regional police forces there cooperate very well with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Peel, Halton, Hamilton, Wentworth, Toronto, York, they all sort of, when something's going down, they work together on projects. And I can show you example after example of that. When things go wrong, you usually have an RCMP involvement somewhere.
So it's interesting to me because I used to do crime reporting when I was just starting out in journalism. And it's been fascinating to me. I mean, I don't do a lot of crime reporting now, every once in a while, but pretty rarely. But it's been fascinating to watch how the culture's changed between the RCMP, and not just the RCMP, but also some of the local police forces. One of the major changes is, for example, the police will very often withhold things like victims' names, like dead victims' names, like murder victims. They'll be reluctant to release names of people who are even accused or have been charged. Like, there's like a culture of ultra privacy and ultra secrecy has come down to the extent that now if someone's murdered in our community, it used to be pretty common practice that the police would release the name of the murdered, because of course the name of the murdered at this point belongs to the community. You don't have the right to keep that private. And so media increasingly has to try and go around police to get basic information about things like who got killed and who's been charged. And that's been a really significant shift in culture. And I'm wondering to what extent what we saw with the Wortman case is just an extension of that extremely closed lack of accountability, lack of transparency kind of culture taking over the RCMP, particularly in Nova Scotia.
Well, absolutely. But, you have to understand, Jen, this was encouraged by the federal government. People thought years ago that they won a great victory with privacy laws. Look,
Yeah.
we had these privacy laws and we're not going to be protected. And the federal government says, yes, we're going to enforce these privacy laws. But what it has done has been a useful way for government and the police to hide everything.
Right.
So it makes it more difficult for any journalist to find out what's really going on. And in Nova Scotia, the victims, the families of the victims, the 22 dead, most of them were hiding behind privacy too, encouraged by the government and the RCMP to do so and not cooperate with the media about what really happened. This all served to make the story disappear, combined with missives on the first day from Prime Minister Trudeau. Don't name the shooter. We don't want to give him fame. They didn't name his girlfriend, wife, because that would be victim shaming, domestic violence shaming.
Right. So it's the use of this kind of, for lack of a better term, woke language or seemingly compassionate language in order to hide and minimize transparency and accountability.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what happened.
Right.
So they hide behind this. Eventually the RCMP made every one of its police officers victims. Although they did nothing, they saved no life. They never got in front of them. They made up stories about what happened. They then said, they don't have to testify because they're all victims.
Well, oh, there you go. So anyway, two questions here. One is, were there other aspects of the official story that don't add up according to the evidence that you have? And secondly, can we get into how Wortman was eventually brought down?
Well, first of all, if you go in loose chronological order. Number one, the night of the 18th, the question becomes, who shot Corey Ellison? Mm-hmm. The evidence strongly suggests that Wortman was not there and did not shoot Corey Ellison. Corey Ellison's own brother said, I think the Mounties shot him. And then he changed the story and apologized, then went back. He still, I understand, believes the RCMP accidentally shot him. I have new evidence that I can't reveal at this time, but I suggest that that is a viable story, that it should be an investigation into who shot Corey Ellison, because I think there's a great possibility, based on the RCMP's own evidence that we went through from the MCC that was largely buried and ignored, that a Mountie accidentally shot Corey Ellison. I think that's a big story.
I think it's a great story too, but I would also, as I said, play a little bit of devil's advocate. Innocent bystanders can get shot by police in highly chaotic sort of circumstances and environments. No one here is alleging that the RCMP purposefully shot.
No. Accidental shootings happen, but admit it.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they played with the evidence, both the MCC, the DOJ, and the RCMP, all three of them, played with the evidence to make the story work that Wortman shot him, but they ignored evidence that kills that story. So that's one of them. The next story going down the line is the total chaos the next morning. They try to make it look like though they just missed Wortman accidentally by this, that, or some other reason, when the chaos is unbelievable and doesn't make sense unless you come to believe. The only thing that makes sense is they were trying to negotiate and bring Wortman in, sort of lure him in, and weren't trying to catch him. That makes more sense than them trying to catch him, because everything they did sort of mitigated against them catching him. The shooting of Heidi Stevenson, the RCMP made it look like they had a variety of stories. Heidi Stevenson was in her vehicle coming around a cloverleaf in Shubenacadie, and Wortman rammed her. And this is like a minute or two after he had shot at another Mountie, Chad Morrison. And so he rammed Stevenson. Stevenson was dead. The cars ended up being burned. Wortman killed an innocent bystander, drove away in his car, the innocent bystander, Joey Weber. Days after that, the RCMP union floated the story that Heidi Stevenson rammed Wortman and took him off the field. A couple of days later, the RCMP came out and made a statement, no, that didn't happen. So they disavowed what the union said happened. But then they came up with another story that Heidi Stevenson got in a gunfight with Wortman. And we didn't hear those details for 2 more years. Then they made the story that, or brought up the story that Heidi Stevenson fired 14 shots at Wortman, nicked him in the head, and that's how he eventually got caught. But the evidence shows that didn't happen. The story was totally concocted. And the final piece of evidence, in fact, I'd written this based on the 27 eyewitnesses and my own observations and measurements, that didn't happen. And after I had done that, I was going through the record one more time through this convoluted record of evidence. And I found a letter from the Serious Incident Response Team interim director, former Judge Pat Curran, who shot down the RCMP on that very theory. The RCMP tried to get him to investigate that Heidi Stevenson had accidentally killed innocent bystander Joey Weber. Therefore, there should be an investigation into a wrongful death by an RCMP gun. And Curran said, literally, get out of here. You already told me she was executed 2 days before, and now you're trying to tell me to do this investigation? I think that's a big story.
Yeah.
That they made this up. You know what I had a senior journalist tell me the other day? Oh, we don't really care if the RCMP made up a story to make one of their officers a hero. You know, it was a tough time for them. And I said, but if they made that up, what else did they make up?
Well, and also that, but like, if your theory of the case is true and the RCMP engaged in or screwed up on multiple levels, including failure to communicate, failure of transparency and openness about what happened, and they did all of this in order to protect their own agent or source, then their attempts to create a hero post hoc is propaganda. They're trying to create a post hoc hero in order to add to the cover up. It's not even just that they're trying to engage in a kind of emotional ploy to try and recover from something traumatic internally. That would suggest to me, hypothetically and allegedly, that they're trying to create this hero figure as a further diversionary tactic to hide from the actual truth of the entire crime.
Absolutely, you're dead on there. But there's another aspect to the why they're covering that up. It's a separate cover up as well. There's another motive. Heidi Stevenson had been on the force, 25 years? She'd spent most of that time on the musical ride. She was a school liaison officer, a press officer. She went in there as a constable, acting as a corporal, not being paid for it. She had failed all her carbine training, so she was not tactical. Failing it 4 times means you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn door with a bullet. You couldn't hit the barn. 2 other female officers who were in the front line that night at Portapic were the same as her, failed their carbine training, couldn't be tactical, couldn't be given a C8, so they couldn't be armed fully for the job. Stevens, and there were a few males who were in that role as well, a corporal. Not just the females, but there's some males as well.
People don't understand that there are different roles within a police service. I mean, if you're a school liaison officer or a press officer, you don't necessarily need to be fully tactically trained. That's fine. There are different roles for you. But if you don't have those certifications, you're probably not shooting a guy in the head at 50 feet.
No, you're not. And the other thing is, she went in there, as we've already said, she didn't know what was really going on because the RCMP didn't give them the full scope of what was going on. She didn't have support. She was alone in her car. I mean, the CBC, the only interview I've done on this subject with the CBC was in 3 days after the massacres. And I was asked about Heidi Stevenson being a hero. And I said, why was she there? Alone. 19 people were already dead.
Yeah.
Why was she alone? Why was she driving? There was no sense of urgency in what she did. She was under-supported, under-trained. This is sort of the story the RCMP didn't want to get out. So the alternative was make her a hero as an example for all female officers. But she's not. The typicality of her being a female officer in the RCMP was She was undertrained, under-resourced, probably harassed, all the negative things they didn't want to discuss because that would hurt their image. And so making her a hero makes her saleable, and they could just make the story go away. And I think it does a disservice to Heidi Stevenson and her legacy. She was a victim of her own force as much as she was a victim of Wortman.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. In Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, 1849, before court cases and commissions, before Canada was Canada, Métis communities in the Upper Great Lakes wrote petitions, Métis men signed their names beneath a statement to the Crown. They wrote to protect their rights and their identity. They wrote because they would not be ignored. They were hunters, trappers, fishermen, voyageurs, and War of 1812 veterans. Like their cousins in Red River who'd petition and resist in the decades that followed, the Métis in the Upper Great Lakes knew how to use the tools of diplomacy. To the west, in Batoche, St. Albert, and the Red River, Métis leaders like Louis Riel also wrote to be heard. They too signed their names with pride and called on governments to honor promises. This was how the Métis asserted themselves again and again, from the Upper Great Lakes to the Rockies. The Métis built Canada's first economy and will never stop reminding the Crown of its promises. Learn more at OntarioMétisFacts.com. Okay, so the Mass Casualty Commission, I mean, I think I have a sense of your impression about that investigation. I mean, do you think that the Mass Casualty Commission was a valuable process at a minimum, or do you think we got more evidence out of it at a minimum?
My intent in writing 22 murders, I should call it 21 murders plus Corey Ellison now, I should retitle it. But the purpose of 22 murders was to force the Mass Casualty Commission to provide evidence, because we had demonstrated, the citizen investigators I worked with, we had demonstrated we could get inside the RCMP, the DOJ, find out what was going on. So we wanted them to produce evidence. They generated evidence, tried to hide a lot of it, and didn't use any of the good stuff basically in their public hearings. The benefit to me of the Mass Casualty Commission was that it generated evidence on paper. We didn't get to see all of it. In fact, we only saw a tiny amount of it. But what we did get out of it was a better picture of what happened. Not in their public evidence. The public evidence, they tended to use the weakest evidence, the worst evidence, to make the narrative work that they wanted to work. But if you dig deeply into it, you find the true narrative. And one of the things I did, Jen, was I'd learned from previous public inquiries that the tactic of the Canadian government in conducting a cover-up was to litter the report, the final report, with actually some of the real facts. And what I did when the Mass Casualty Commission came out, they had 7 volumes. And I went immediately to the 7th volume that no one looked at. It was called Process. By then, all the stories had been written and reporters were already leaving town and they were done with the story. And in the 7th volume, halfway through it, there's a whole section describing how the Department of Justice and the RCMP failed to cooperate and played games with important documents throughout the entire process and made work for the Mass Casualty Commission extremely difficult. And it was an admission that all the transparency of working together was bull. And I knew I would find that because I'd learned that in a previous inquiry. That's what they did in the Arar inquiry. The facts were hidden in the second addendum about what really was going on.
Interesting.
But when I reported that, everyone ignored it.
So, couple things. One question is, one of the things that really has blown my mind about this particular massacre and this particular case is the degree to which it has kind of been collectively memory holed. It's been forgotten. And even when I'm going back and trying to explain what happened, I find my own memory of it is kind of spotty. It seems like it's a really confusing case. I'm a bit overwhelmed by it. I think there's a couple reasons why that is. One of which, of course, being that this happened in 2020. We were all going through COVID. I think all of us are kind of collectively spushing 2020 down into the back of our minds. We're not really thinking about it. But I think that your position here, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that a lot of the lack of collective memory about this incident was purposeful, that it is the result of choices that the federal government and the RCMP chose to make in terms of how information was disclosed and released. And also the lack of collective memory is also the result of, frankly, shoddy reporting. So I wanted to ask you, firstly, I mean, what do you think the police and the federal government did, purposefully or otherwise, to kind of contribute to the mass forgetting of this tragedy?
Well, they muddied the waters from the beginning, saying it was a domestic violence case gone wrong. The Mass Casualty Commission was instructed to use restorative justice principles, and that it be trauma informed, and no one was to be traumatized. Under the instructions of Mr. Trudeau, Wortman's name would never be released, so it would always be the perpetrator, etc. You couldn't even find stories about him.
By the way, that's insane. There's no the idea that you wouldn't release the perpetrator's name is completely goddamn nuts.
But Jen, the media went along with it right across the country. 7 months afterwards, in 22 Murders in the summer of, which came out in 2022, I described an incident where I sat down with two mainstream reporters, one from the Globe and Mail, one from Maclean's magazine, and we're talking at a restaurant about naming Lisa Banfield. This is like getting later, months and months afterwards. And I was told by the Globe and Mail reporter, you can't name her. She's a victim.
Here's where I'm going to rant about journalism here. The idea that we don't name victims, since when and according to whom and who decided that rule? Because it wasn't us.
Oh, and it's detrimental
to consent to that.
It's detrimental to understanding the story and piercing through the veil of secrecy.
There are circumstances where we legally can't name the victim. If there's a publication ban, generally if the victim's been a victim of sexual assault, we don't name them. But we used to name victims all the time, because if you're a victim of a crime, that's actually public information. The public has a need to know that. That's within the public purview. So I when did we all agree to that? Why did we all agree to that? That's kind of insane to me. It's completely insane to me.
Well, it's nurturing sort of the narcissism of people that, I'm going to be hurt if this and embarrassed when this information gets out. The position I took was putting every name on the record. In Frank magazine, in talk shows I did, in 22 Murders, put every name on the record and see where that lays, because people read it or heard it and they would say, well, here's something you should know that's important to the case involving that person. And that's exactly how it worked out. Putting the names of police officers on the record, I found out some of their histories that led me into other avenues that provided good, deep background. But if you keep everyone's name secret, it works to the advantage of the government and the police.
Yes, this works.
That's exactly
you're not actually protecting the public. You're not serving your duty to the public. You're serving your duty to power at that point, because you're. That's exactly right.
I mean, in 22 Murders, I described the relationship between one of the victims and Wortman, that they'd had a long-term sexual relationship. And the family didn't want this to come out, but it was important to understand the heat that was building up in that community because of the amount of the sex that was going on and the criminality that was going on, all of those things. And that ended up bringing forward other people who filled in gaps, because they said, yeah, that's true, but this is also what was going on. So I was able to build the story it's like old school reporting, incrementally building the story bit by bit by bit.
It seems to me like there's like a conflict of ethos here about whether or not you as a journalist or how should I say this, is your duty fundamentally to the public, or is your duty fundamentally to the police? And naming the victim strikes me as one of those tension points, because I can see circumstances where it might not be appropriate to name a victim. If a victim genuinely is innocent, caught up in something beyond their control, I can see a certain compassionate side of myself that wouldn't want to necessarily drag that person through it. But if the victim is central to the understanding what's happening in the story, your duty first and foremost is to serve the interests of the public, not the police. And the interests of the public are best served by naming. So it's an interesting tension there?
Well, when I started this, the families who are still, most of the families of the victims resist cooperating with the media. They've all signed DNA, not DNA, yeah,
Do not just NDAs?
NDAs.
Wait, what? Why are the families, the victims, being asked to sign NDAs at all?
Well,
If you
they
choose
signed it
not,
with the
if you
government in order to get funding for the MCC. So they were all
what?
funded with $100,000, given lawyers. Each of them got $100,000 legal retainer.
Okay, so
But
wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Okay, hold on. There's no reason for a victim's family to sign an NDA. If you choose not to cooperate with the media, there's nothing that we in the media can do to compel you as a victim or a victim's family to cooperate. So like if I knock on your door and say you want to talk and you as the family don't want to talk, you can just say screw off and I'm kicked off your property. As someone who's done crime reporting, I've been kicked off properties. It's part of the job. But what does the government get out of forcing victims' families to sign NDAs in exchange for funding?
easy. You don't have emotional families on camera heating up the story, and the government is allowed to control the story then with the promise that the families will get money at the end of the day out of some settlement. That's basically how it works. And then the RCMP worked behind the scenes, basically telling people, don't cooperate with people, especially me, because they're just going to sensationalize it and make money out of it. I was never in it for the money. You don't write Canadian nonfiction in Canada to make money.
Yeah, I'm sure you're rolling in the millions, Paul.
Yeah, rolling in the pennies, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, the only reason to convince a victim's family to sign an NDA, because that doesn't, as I said, I'll remind people, if you're a victim of a crime, you can choose or not choose to cooperate with the media or not cooperate with the media. That's your personal choice based on your personal circumstances, whatever you want to do. But to sign a legal document committing to not working with the media, that serves only one entity in this, and that's the government and the RCMP. That doesn't serve the media because, sorry, that doesn't serve the victim's family because a non-disclosure agreement isn't binding on the media. It's only binding on the family. So like that blows my mind. That's insane that they got them to do that.
And well, they did that, but I pointed out to the families from the beginning, I'm not here for you. I'm here for the dead people. Their interests and your interests are different. I'm here to get justice for them, but I'm also here because of the huge public policy issues here involving the police, the government, secrecy, cover-ups, things like that. That's my motivation, is to get to the bottom of what happened here and get to the truth. Which brings up one thing, Jen, you were going to say that the end of Wortman.
Yes,
Becomes one of these things. The RCMP and the government and the MCC concocted a story and they stood by this story that 2 Mounties happened upon Wortman, identified him, and then eventually shot him. Clearly, that's not what happened. The evidence shows quite clearly the RCMP knew he was there. They went up in a 5.5 second period from the time the vehicle stops to the first bullet. They were there to kill him. And there was no attempt to negotiation or whatever. It was about shooting Wortman. That's what it was all about. And the evidence showed that, and I clearly lay that out in Anatomy of a Cover-Up. So that's another one of the concocted stories. And then the last one being Wortman is not an agent. He clearly was an agent. And the last part of that, the piece of evidence, getting back to the $475,000 that he took out from Brinks, the one piece of evidence the MCC didn't tender before the public was the release form that Wortman was shown signing in the video I obtained. I went back to my original sources and said, who authorized that release? And my sources said, RCMP New Brunswick. Never disclosed by the MCC. The very same sources who gave me the tapes and told me that Wortman got the money says it was authorized by the New Brunswick RCMP. So this was all covered up by the Mass Casualty Commission and the government.
Okay, so couple things. One, you've now written two books on this subject. Anatomy of a Cover-Up came out what, a month ago?
Yep.
Okay. Everything that you've discussed with me on this podcast is essentially in your book, so it is already in the public sphere. It's already been, vetted
Yep.
by your publisher's lawyers.
Yep.
It's now public knowledge. So we're not releasing anything in this podcast that is not already in your book, and I would really encourage people to check it out in order to get greater detail. But has the RCMP responded to any of some of the blockbuster allegations that you've made in this book and in this podcast?
Well, that's the thing. The RCMP, beginning in 2008, began the policy of dealing with me. It began with an email from then Commissioner William Elliott, never to engage me because you can't win. That's basically what the email said to all Mounties. What you have now is the government and the RCMP. We have this strange standoff. I have a book where I use evidence that, published by Random House, showing that the RCMP concocted a narrative about what happened, and it was approved by the Mass Casualty Commission and the federal government, to the point where the commissioner of the MCC was given the Order of Canada this week for his great work on the MCC. And I'm showing that that didn't happen, that this was a cover-up. The RCMP has chosen, like the government, to not respond. So now we have this standoff. You think maybe somebody in the New York Times or the Economist can write about it, because no one in Canada will write about it. That I'm saying they made up a bunch of stories, passed it off to the public, and nobody is saying anything because they're just hoping it'll go away. And why is the media not saying anything? Because one of the things I do in Anatomy of a Cover-Up, against my own interests, I guess, is point out where the media and specific media people did things that served the government's interest and not the public interest in reporting their stories. I mean, Jen, if you go back to Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, their 1988 book, this is essentially a story not about dead people, but about how consent is manufactured in Canada by the government. How they've essentially, the media goes along with the easiest story. The easiest story nowadays is handed to them by official sources.
Right.
They don't have to work. They don't have to check it out. That's what they come to believe.
Well, again, here's where I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, and that is the resourcing to dig into this isn't there anymore. Most media who are covering the Mass Casualty Commission, for example, are going to get flown in. They're going to have to do 3 hits a day or 2 stories a day with live blogs, and then they're going to get flown back out again, right? Like, I don't even know who has bureau in Nova Scotia anymore. I'm not even sure if CBC. CBC must still have bureau in Nova Scotia, but like it's all of the media have radically reduced resources to what they used to have. There are way more investigative stories than we have ability to cover. I mean, Matt and I at The Line are as guilty of this as anybody else. We're just loser columnists, right? And we're trying to maintain something resembling a wage with a Substack and some duct tape. I love the opportunity to be able to talk to you, but I don't have the resources or the time to put into writing 2 books on this subject like you have. So, I think that somehow the mentality about journalism has fundamentally changed. And I think that that's also a reflection of the resourcing, if that makes sense.
Well, I think the mentality started to change, 25, 30 years ago.
Right.
And essentially the media really got out of it, the investigative journalism business. Because what is investigative journalism? At its core, investigative journalism is providing alternative narratives to the official narrative.
Yeah,
it's not about putting people in jail. It's about getting to the real facts of the story.
Right.
But what we've evolved in, getting back to manufacturing consent, is to propagate the propaganda model, as Edward S. Herman talked about, the propaganda model of journalism, where journalists have for a long, and journalism entities, institutions have come to realize this, the easiest news to get is from official sources. Official
Yeah.
sources give you the story. You don't have to check it. You're bulletproof. You can report it, move on, do another one. And the official sources, the institutions and private companies know how to play the media to feed them, keep them busy doing those kinds of stories. And people, conversely, the public has become turned off to this. Why read media?
Yeah.
Why read public media when all they're doing is doling out official source stuff to you?
Yeah.
I've had that here. I've had this in this story where I said, I don't believe Lisa Banfield, scantily dressed as she was outside for 10 hours on a night where it snowed in Halifax and did not have hypothermia or any other damage. And a reporter, I said this to, you know what she said to me? Did the police tell you that? Are the police saying that? And I said, no, I've got a better source. And they said, who? I said, nature. Nature tells me
Common
that didn't
sense. Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
But they're so dependent on official sources, they can't see the stories even when they're right in front of them. As I said, what happened to reporters? They've had the instinct bred out of them. They're like, Irish
Yeah.
setters lost at the end of their leash. They may be there looking at the story, but they can't see the story.
Man, that's a brutal assessment, but I don't think it's wrong.
As I said, Jen,
We've
I
been
think it's a
domesticated.
fascinating standoff I have here. I've written a book alleging these things. The police killed a person. Imagine if this had gone on in the United States. The
Oh,
police
could
had
never happen.
accidentally killed
Never
someone in a
happen.
rampage, and then the
Yeah.
police made up stories to hide this. There would be reporters, TV shows, 48 hours, everyone proving that the police did it. But in Canada, it has long worked this way that the government can shape the story and the police can shape stories, even if they're not true. And the Canadian public, they're deferential as they are, buy it. They don't want to know what they don't want to know.
Something that I've really also I struggle to explain to people outside of journalism is what it's like talking to a police officer in America versus talking to a police officer in Canada. If you as a journalist call like an RCMP or a CIA or somebody like this and they'll talk to you, they'll talk to you. Like they actually talk to you and they give you like no talking points. It's like they'll actually lay out with you. I've had experiences where I've contacted like the media department of like a local county sheriff's office, and the media officer on gets back to me within 20 minutes, no problem, like happy to help, no problem. Like, and then you compare that to talking to anybody within officialdom in any government department in Canada. And, these guys, I mean, it's been shown through stories, these guys can't send out a tweet without a 20 email back and forth between 20 different stakeholders, right? Like it's the culture, the communications culture has become corrosive and closed in Canada. And the media has responded to that by effectively becoming domesticated. Whereas in America, I will say this for America, it's the opposite is true. It's like the journalists still seem to have some fucking spine about them. And the communications infrastructure has to evolve to meet them, not the other way around. And I don't know if that's a cult. I don't know if that's the result of the way that our processes and institutions work, or if that is a cultural difference or some combination of both. I mean, very few of us look to America right now and say there's a well-functioning society. But when it comes to sort of openness and transparency, it's not even close. We are a radically more closed society and less transparent society in Canada than America, and it's hard to even put in words the scope and scale of the difference.
But I think you've hit it right on the head, the nail right on the head. The deferential nature of Canadian journalists is astounding. Like I have two books, 22 Murders and Anatomy of a Cover-Up. Both were instant #1 bestsellers in Canada. Major media have not discussed those books at all. I defy you to find a column or a news report about them.
The Walrus did republish, I believe. Did they not? Yeah, the Walrus republished a section.
Well, the Walrus just republished the excerpt from the Anatomy, but no coverage of the news stories. Nothing at all. Explain the execution of Gabriel Wortman. Explain the relationship with Gabriel Wortman. It's all obvious stuff. Why have we spent a month here where they haven't said a word about what I've done? Because they can't say a word about it. So they're making it disappear. And it seems to me the duty of the media should be to get involved and advocate for the dead here and hold the institutions accountable for this story. I'm trying to do it, but I'm not the only person who can do it. Other people have to join in and hold the government and the RCMP accountable. It's all there laid out. Yeah, it's going to take a little work, but I've been working at it for a number of years to prove it.
Well, on that note, I think that's a perfect opportunity to sign off. Paul Palango, Anatomy of a Cover-Up is your latest book. I presume that it is available on Amazon and all fine retailers, all fine book retailers.
It's available everywhere, and I even did the audio version.
Fantastic. Well, you've worked very hard for it. Well, as I said, thank you very much for having the time. I mean, it sounds to me like you have enough for another book coming. So, do you have a sense of when the next book may come out?
We're currently I'm actually working on 2 other books right now. So we're still negotiating with what's going to go first.
You're putting me to shame, sir. You've managed to come up with 2 books when I was supposed to have come up with 1 3 years ago. So you're making me feel bad about myself.
Well, the last thing about it, Jen, is this book is not about the murders. It's the story of how Canada works. And people should understand that. If you want to understand how things work and how consent is manufactured, Anatomy of the Cover-Up lays it all out for you.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Paul. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that we will be in touch again soon.
Anytime. Thank you.